From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
I first met Dr. Olsen about 7 years ago when I was a senior at Washington College. While he was a fairly new professor at the time, he taught with such enthusiasm and clarity that he quickly became one of my favorites. A lifelong fan of J.R.R. Tolkien's work, he brought that passion to the classroom during every seminar for his Tolkien class, which he still teaches today, alongside courses in Chaucer, courtly love, Arthurian literature, the Bible, and Greco-Roman mythology. The same passion even drove him toward his initial studies in medieval literature while earning his BA from Williams College and his PhD from Columbia University. It also spurred him into taking his love of Tolkien both outside the classroom and into another education model entirely. Beginning as the Tolkien Professor, Dr. Olsen crafted an ongoing series of podcasts that sought to bring a close readership of Tolkien to a wider audience. From there, after encouragement from his listeners, he went on to establish the Mythgard Institute in 2011. This unique online university offers MAs with a particular focus in fantasy literature, including classes that explore the Chronicles of Narnia, Harry Potter, and, of course, Tolkien's works. Now, with the publication of Exploring J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit, his scholarship will be able to extend further still to new groups of students, young and old, that will hopefully learn as much as I did and more during my time as his student. Please welcome to the stage Dr. Corey Olsen.
Well, good afternoon. Good to see so many people, and lovely to see former students like Beth, who I've had the great pleasure of having in class before. I wanted to start off by sort of explaining a little bit about what I do, or rather about what I don't do. I think that sometimes people aren't really quite sure what a book like this is about. This is Exploring J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit. Let me just explain right off the beginning. I don't have, there's no secret code that I have found within The Hobbit that you can crack and discover like divine mysteries. I have no insider information. I've discovered no lost manuscript that unfolds everything that we're supposed to know. I've also received no messages from beyond the grave. I have held no seances in which I've spoken with the spirit of J.R.R. Tolkien and therefore have a unique insight into what he was doing. What I do in my book, what I do on my podcast is the same thing that I do in class. I'm a teacher who enjoys reading slowly and paying careful attention to what a book says. To me, what I do, I don't like the phrase literary criticism. Who does like the phrase literary criticism? I mean, seriously, is there anybody for whom the phrase literary criticism sends this like thrill down your spine? Right? Most people, it's like slightly repugnant or very repugnant even. When I think about what I want to do in the classroom, what I've tried to do in my book, it's much more like storytelling. Sometimes you hear creative writing teachers say, when you're writing a story, show, don't tell. Right? Don't just explain what's going on. Just show it and make the reader experience it. And a great writer can do that. My job is the telling part. Right now, someone else has written the story, and then I go through until the story's already been told. But there's so much that you can see. There's so much that you can notice when you stop and pay attention and read carefully. And that's what I love to do, and that's what I've done in my book. As Beth mentioned, I started several years ago, 3 years ago now, my podcast called The Tolkien Professor. And the idea there was just sort of taking the kind of stuff, the kind of work that I do, the kind of readings that I do and discussion of Tolkien, and doing what was essentially alternative publication, to actually put it on the internet and engage people in conversation. And I was really delighted and rather surprised at the number of people who desired to engage in that conversation. As Beth mentioned, I've founded the Mythgard Institute to be able to offer courses online and make that available for people who want to study those books further. It has also led to this book, to be able to see, hey, there are people, again, normally it's a little hard to be like, oh yeah, that hot-selling work of literary criticism. But the stories that we love, there is so much to them, and there's so much more to see when you stop and look at it carefully. So what I'm going to do today, primarily, is I want to do a little bit of a look at one theme in The Hobbit. At this sort of, we're going to do a little sample discussion of some of The Hobbit here. So I have my book, and I'm going to read a few passages for you. We're going to start in chapter 11 of The Hobbit. This is after Bilbo and the dwarves have gotten to the Lonely Mountain. but they haven't gotten in yet. They're sitting up there on the side of the mountain. They have found the place where they're really quite sure the secret door must be, but they haven't figured out how to get it open. Of course, the map told them how it was going to open, but they've completely ignored that, and they're trying to beat on it with their picks, right, which is a really dumb thing to do, apart from the fact that it's obviously not going to work. There's a live dragon on the other side of the door, and it's really not smart. But the dwarves are not, in fact, very smart in the book. So, and not only they're not very smart, they're quite depressed. And they are quickly defeated, emotionally speaking, at this portion of the book, having had their very premature welcome home celebration down in Lake Town. Now they're sort of realizing that it's not quite so easy as all that. So this is near the end of chapter 11. The Hobbit was no longer much brighter than the dwarves. He would do nothing but sit with his back to the rock face and stare away west through the opening, over the cliff, over the wide lands to the black wall of Mirkwood, and to the distances beyond, in which he sometimes thought he could catch glimpses of the misty mountains, small and far. If the dwarves asked him what he was doing, he answered, "You said sitting on the doorstep and thinking would be my job, not to mention getting inside, so I'm sitting and thinking." But I'm afraid he was not thinking much about the job, but of what lay beyond the blue distance, the quiet western land and the hill with his hobbit hole under it. So what we get here is this interesting kind of moment. The dwarves, of course, are excited, but they're frustrated. They're frustrated because they're almost there. Their quest is almost finished, right? Their journey is almost complete. They've been going to the Lonely Mountain, and they're trying to reclaim not only the treasure that Smaug took from them, which matters very much to the dwarves, but their ancestral land, and this is a big deal. And they're almost there, but they can't figure out how to take that last step. And of course, they have no plans about what to do with the dragon when they do manage to take that last step. But that's their situation. Bilbo, of course, is in a very different position than the dwarves are in. He is not 98% of the way through with his journey. Bilbo is 49% of the way through his journey. He's almost halfway there because, of course, the dwarves are on this one-way trip from the Shire, which they frankly don't really need to see again, to their lands, which they're trying to return to. Bilbo's trip, however, is a there and back again journey, as of course it says in the subtitle of the book, right? He is the only one for whom this place was not really his destination. He's just on this circuitous round trip. And he is sitting there on the side of the mountain, looking back towards his home. But of course you notice, at least at this point, this is the point in the book where I noticed for the first time, and by the way, I didn't notice this until I'd read it many, many times. I notice new things every time I read it. It's one of the things that's so much fun about it. That of course, when you actually look at where he's sitting and where he's looking back to, when you look at these two different endpoints of the journey, he starts off at the hill, of course, capital T, capital H. That's where he lives, right? Bag End is in the hill, Hobbiton. And his destination, or at least for Bilbo, the halfway point in his journey is the mountain, right? So you've got the hill at the beginning of the journey and the mountain at the end of the journey. And in this moment, Tolkien kind of draws our attention to that as he's sitting on the mountain, looking back at the hill. And, so that seems kind of interesting. We've got these two, hill and mountain, at the beginning and at the end of his journey. Suggests, is there, a sort of a correspondence there? You've got Bilbo with his home inside the hill, and the dwarves with their home, except actually now it's Smaug's, the dragon's home, inside the mountain. What's the relationship between these two things? Well, surely they're opposite, right? I mean, certainly they're on opposite ends of the poles in many ways. But this connection, this potential connection between the two, is brought up again almost immediately in the beginning of the next chapter, after the secret door has opened, and Bilbo's now going to actually go down. Oh, sorry, I'm on the wrong page. That's the problem here. Okay. "Now you're in for it at last, Bilbo Baggins," he said to himself. "You went and put your foot right in it that night of the party, and now you've got to pull it out and pay for it. Dear me, what a fool I was and am," said the least tookish part of him. "I have absolutely no use for dragon-guarded treasures, and the whole lot could stay here forever if only I could wake up and find that this beastly tunnel was my own front hall at home." He did not wake up, of course, but went still on and on till all sign of the door behind had faded away. He rather wishes that the hallway down into Smaug's home were his own front hall into his little hole at home. Now, again, The point here is contrast, right? It's very different. And he, Bilbo, is forswearing any interest in dragon-guarded treasure. He is not interested in this adventurous thing. Really, he just wishes he could get back home, and he is calling himself a fool for having gone on this trip in the first place. Because it's about the treasure, right? They're trying to reclaim their gold, and he doesn't want their gold. What does he want? There's this really interesting moment in the middle of the book, in chapter 5, when he's doing his riddle game with Gollum. I love the riddles that he tells, not just because they're fun as riddles, but if you look at them carefully, one of the things that I argue about them is you can actually see both of them, both Bilbo and Gollum, really kind of showing some things about themselves in the riddles that they choose to tell. You can see a lot about their point of view and their, the worlds that they live in when you look at the kinds of riddles that they tell. And one of Bilbo's riddles I find particularly interesting and connected to this whole hill and mountain idea, and that's the egg riddle, right? A box without hinges, key, or lid, yet golden treasure inside is hid, right? And on the one hand, it's sort of a conspicuous riddle to be telling in this context. That is, in the context of his trip to the Lonely Mountain, which is all about the golden treasure that's hidden inside this mountain that the dwarves are going to go back and find. But of course, that's not the golden treasure that Bilbo is primarily thinking of. What is the golden treasure inside of eggs that Bilbo is most? Well, he's actually the egg part, right? When he's sitting there alone in the tunnels just earlier in the same chapter, what is he thinking about? Bacon and eggs, right? This is what really matters to Bilbo. When he tries to escape, he doesn't fantasize about gold, he fantasizes about bacon and eggs. So again, clearly, the hill and the mountain, very different worlds. They seem almost opposite. So Bilbo, he's not at all dragonish, has nothing in common with dragons. Well, no, not in the sense of desiring treasure. But when we hear about Smaug back in chapter 1, we learn that being dragonish, what makes dragons characteristically dragonish, is not primarily the business about their greed. That is not greed and manifested as just the desire for gold. What really makes them unique is this. This is Thorin explaining the history. He says, dragons steal gold and jewels, from men and elves and dwarves, wherever they can find them. And they guard their plunder as long as they live, which is practically forever unless they are killed, and never enjoy a brass ring of it. And that's the most important thing. To be a dragon is not just to be greedy, not just to desire to get wealth. The real image of dragonishness, as Tolkien describes it in The Hobbit, is that desire to get and then to sit on it. He has this heap of treasure piled up, and what good does it do him? He's in this desolate wasteland all by himself, alone with his huge pile of treasure. Right? That is the essence of dragonishness. And of course, Bilbo himself he's not exactly like a dragon, right? He's not completely dragonish. We don't see him there in his bachelor pad in Bag End, like heaping up his bacon and eggs and being like, mine, it's all mine, right? That's not really exactly the spirit of Bilbo Baggins. And yet, there is a sense in which he is hoarding those things to himself. He takes this life entirely for granted. He's never really thought about it. He doesn't really appreciate it. He has this those things which he is valuing throughout the rest of the story, the things that he's looking back on while he's on his journey, imagining sitting next to the fireside and listening to his kettle just beginning to sing. He had that stuff. That peace and comfort and security that came with his Baggins life, he had, a heaping hoard of that. He had the equivalent of the treasure of Thror, of this peace and comfort and security, which he never valued because he never really understood. Until he comes home at the end. He doesn't really appreciate it. Now look, the last passage I want to read to you is his song at the end. This is actually not Bilbo's first piece of poetic composition. Bilbo, of course, will become in the Lord of the Rings famous for writing poetry all the time. And whenever he stands up at his party, everybody's afraid he's going to start reciting his own poetry. But he is very prosy, or at least he thinks of himself as very prosy in The Hobbit. So it's an important moment when Bilbo writes his first poem. That's actually earlier on in the story, the very first poem he ever composes is when he is making making his breakthrough into that new and cutting-edge genre of spider aggravation poetry. You'll remember the songs he made, Attercop and Tom Noddy, which are really quite successful poems within their genre, right? I mean, if you sort of account for that, they moved his audience in precisely the way he was hoping to move his audience. But his first sort of real poem, real song, is the song that he sings just as he's about to come home. He and Gandalf are returning to the Shire, well, that place which in the Lord of the Rings Tolkien will call the Shire, and the hill has just come into view. He's just seen the hill, now again off into the distance, and he suddenly breaks into poetry. Roads go ever, ever on, over rock and under tree, by caves where never sun has shone, by streams that never find the sea, over snow by winter sown, and through the merry flowers of June, over grass and over stone, and under mountains in the moon. Roads go ever, ever on, under cloud and under star, yet feet that wandering have gone turn at last to home afar. Eyes that fire and sword have seen, and horror in the halls of stone, look at last on meadows green, and trees and hills they long have known. It's a coming home song. Now, of course, this song is going to become, in altered form, incorporated as this sort of, this very important theme in The Lord of the Rings. We'll see Bilbo sing a very altered version of the Roads Go Ever, Ever On song at the beginning of the Fellowship of the Ring, and Frodo quote that as well. But here, when he first sings it, it's a coming home song. It's the song that he sings right as he's about to get back, the poem that he recites. What we can see in the first stanza there is his connection. He recognizes now, he's been walking down this road from the Lonely Mountain. And that road from the Lonely Mountain has taken him back to his front doorstep. And in this moment, he seems to be realizing the significance of that. Roads go ever, ever on, by caves where never sun has shone, by streams that never find the sea, over snow by winter sown. He's recognizing this path that's leading him up to his front door, this path which has always been so familiar to him. As he will say, as Frodo will recall him saying later on, this is the same road that goes to the Lonely Mountain. He now recognizes that Bag End, that his home which he has been longing for, is not isolated. It's not separate from the rest of the world. It's a part of this world that he's no longer isolated. And of course, we see that in the next chapter, later on in this chapter, near the very end of the book, when years later Gandalf and Balin visit him. He is no longer shut away in this tiny little isolated world like Smaug in his treasure chamber, from which he hasn't left, as far as we can tell, for years. Right? He lives this completely, Smaug the dragon lives this totally isolated life. That's what it is to be a dragon. Bilbo, he had neighbors and stuff. It's not that he was totally isolated, but he was cut off from the world. He didn't know anything about anything that was beyond the borders of his little land and the little walks that he had mapped out in his hallway, right? And now he sees there is a wider world, and my home is part of it. So that's the first thing we see. In the second stanza, we can see a little bit of anxiety. That is, he's gone there, right? Feet that wandering have gone turn at last to home afar. Eyes that fire and sword have seen, and horror in the halls of stone look at last on meadows green, and trees and hills they once have known. He's seen a lot. He's experienced a lot. He's been through a lot. And now he's coming back. And I think we can see here a kind of implicit question. He's been there. Can he come back again? What are those eyes that have now seen those things? How's it going to be? How's it going to look when he returns home? He's been looking forward to coming home and looking forward to coming home. What's it going to be like when he actually does? And what he finds is that it's better. It's far better. The kettle singing on the hearth has never sounded more musical to him than it does when he comes back. For Bilbo, his trip into the world of adventure, his whole story is not one about leaving that quiet world behind, right? This is not a sort of a conversion from quiet, dumpy, bourgeois, stay-at-home guy into, rugged action hero adventurer who is now like, and at the end of The Hobbit, they reveal like the Bilbo Baggins signal that we will send up when we need the Hobbit hero to come back out. Like, that's not his story, right? His story is one really of development of both sides of his character, both his stay-at-home Baggins side and his adventurous Took side. And when both of those are fully developed and he fully understands and appreciates appreciates both of them, and they work together to give him both courage and wisdom. Now he can return home and find that his experience at home is far richer than it was before. Having now developed that Tookish side, the Baggins side doesn't diminish. It actually increases and definitely improves. This trajectory, this experience, this phenomenon of ceasing to take for granted the stuff around you, the familiar things that you love and that you rely on. This is something that Tolkien called recovery, and he actually argued that this was an essential element, an essential thing that you get from fantasy. It's one of the major roles of fantasy, that fantasy helps us, in fact, to recover the things around us. And you can see him sort of illustrating how Bilbo himself discovers this. My own goal as a teacher, my goal as a writer, is essentially to try to help people do the same thing. If you've never read The Hobbit before, you should, and you should definitely see it before you see the film. But read the book. You have a great adventure ahead of you. But if you have read The Hobbit, I bet that a lot of you have read The Hobbit, and I bet that a lot of you here who have read The Hobbit more than 10 years ago, that it's been a long time since you've read The Hobbit. The Hobbit might be a book that you look back on with great fondness, but you have it in your hoard, right? It's one of your book hoard that you pile up and sleep on, right? So, don't pretend. I know it's true. So basically, my highest goal for my book, my goal for my work as a teacher is to invite you to see the book with new eyes, to read through it carefully again, to discover things about the story that you haven't seen before, or that you've taken for granted, or that you've forgotten. And I think that when you do, like Bilbo returning to Bag End, you'll come back to it with a new appreciation and a new affection for it. So thank you very much for having me today. I'd be delighted to take questions. I always love talking about Tolkien and the Hobbit, so please, I'd be happy to answer questions. Yeah, Moira, go ahead.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yeah, no, it's...
Is it on now? Okay,
yeah, there you go.
great. Okay, so if you haven't read The Hobbit in a while and you have your book, you're recommending reading your book and then going back to The Hobbit, or reading The Hobbit and then going to your book?
My ideal picture is that like people will hold The Hobbit in their left hand and my book in their right hand. When I was writing the book, my first thought was that I was thinking about structuring it sort of thematically, like, I'll look at Bilbo's career, and I'll look at Thorin, and I'll look at Gandalf, and I'll talk about all these things. In the end, I decided to structure the book chapter by chapter so that people could more easily read the two of them together. So I would definitely recommend read The Hobbit and then read my book. But there have been one or two people, most of them family members of mine, who have said, I've never read The Hobbit before, but I'm really enjoying your book, to which I say, why? How? Anyway, okay. But no, definitely read The Hobbit first, and then read my book, and to go back and forth. Yeah.
I know that in Lord of the Rings, especially, Tolkien was trying to create essentially an Anglo mythology, and drew a lot on Norse mythology to do that. So you get Gandalf as a very Odin-like figure. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the specific influences that come up in The Hobbit. Yeah. Tolkien certainly loved Norse stuff and Norse mythology, and he said that he had given up on the whole mythology for England idea. I'm not sure I totally believe him. He said that he had given up, but I'm not sure that in his secret heart he really had. In The Hobbit, he borrows much more directly from Norse mythology than he does anywhere else. That is, like all of the dwarves' names. If you wonder where the dwarves' names come from, they all come from the Völuspá. They all come from the Edda. There's this long list of names, and he just plucked names. It seems almost at random. So all Dori, Nori, Ori, Dwalin, all of them, except for Balin. Balin is not in the Völuspá. I don't know the story about Balin, but anyways, so the rest of them he's just taken straight from there. Gandalf is a name straight from there, though Gandalf is a dwarf's name.
actually. And I don't know if you knew this, in the first draft of The Hobbit, when Tolkien first was writing the manuscript of The Hobbit, Gandalf was the name of the chief of the dwarves. He was not named Thorin, he was named Gandalf. And the wizard's name was Bloodorthin. So just try to picture to yourself like a little Bloodorthin statuette, right? Or you're like Bloodorthin for president, badges. Yeah, it was like that close. But anyway, then he shifted it and he made Gandalf into the wizard and made the dwarf Thorin. That happens, by the way, the first time in the manuscript that Thorin becomes the dwarf's name is when he emerges from the barrels at Lake Town. He's Gandalf all the way up through that point in the story, but then finally, when he comes out of the barrel, he's Thorin Oakenshield for the first time. But it's a very dramatic moment in the manuscript history. So anyway, so there are things like that. But see, Tolkien would be the first one to say that although he's taking those things straight from the Völuspá, it's not really references to Norse mythology. And that basically he was using those names and he loved the names, but it's not actually sort of a reference to the story in that way. But that's fairly typical with Tolkien. He is influenced by a lot of things, and he uses a lot of elements for things, but he doesn't really sort of try to kind of illustrate it or demonstrate it. He's not retelling the myths, right? He'll take bits from it. Certainly, if you know Norse mythology, you'll see some Fafnir and Smaug. I mean, there's definitely some relationship there. Smaug is also even more like the dragon in Beowulf. And Bilbo becomes like if you've read Beowulf all the way through, you know that instead of just the Grendel bit at the beginning, if you've read it all the way through to the end, you know that there's this dragon who has this hoard of treasure, and there's this random unnamed little thief who sneaks in to the hall of the dragon and steals a golden cup and runs away, and the dragon wakes up and is furious and goes out and destroys a town because of it. And it's sort of a fun thing because we don't know why the thief in Beowulf did that. He's unnamed, and there's literally a hole, like a burned hole in the unique manuscript of Beowulf at that section. So we don't know what that guy was doing. And so in this place, like many places in Anglo-Saxon stuff, Tolkien seems to have kind of taken that and being like, okay, here's the story. I'll tell you why that little dude snuck in there and took the golden cup. Here's the story. So there are ways in which he incorporates stuff like that, but he didn't want to retell the story and stuff. So we don't get a lot of that direct things. But really good question. Yeah.
So what got you into examining Tolkien's work and critiquing it, like you said earlier?
Yeah, well, I've been reading Tolkien ever since I was a kid. I first read The Hobbit when I was 8. And as my older sister can tell you, I was an insufferable lecturer from a very young age. I considered myself a world expert on Tolkien by the time I was 13 at least. My shining moment was the year when my older sister's English class had Fellowship of the Ring assigned to it. And she rather wanted to make sure that she was prepared for the pop quizzes, but she wasn't quite so enthusiastic about reading the book. So she would come over to me, so I'd be like, let me explain, right? It's just kind of, I just kind of have been like that. But basically I have found my own reading experiences of Tolkien, reading it. I've been reading. I read The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings about once a year. I have ever since I was 8, and I've never failed to notice something new, to find something new in it when I read it again. So yeah, just my whole career as a teacher and now as a writer has really just kind of grown out of that desire to share this really awesome stuff that you see when you read the book with people. So yeah. Misspent youth, in short. Yeah. Yeah.
Hi, thanks. Your comment about the name changes is related to the question I have, and with particular attention to the significant change in the plot of the Gollum scene.
Yes.
From an early edition to a later edition of The Hobbit after Lord of the Rings came out. Do you feel like this increased attention to the manuscript process and the changes in the names and the plot lines adds to or detracts from the non-scholarly enjoyment of the work as he meant it? Thank you.
Tolkien was so brilliant at that kind of thing. What he did, what he was referring to was, a lot of people don't realize the first edition of The Hobbit, the Gollum scene was very different.
if you had read The Hobbit in 1937 when it came out, what you would have found was Bilbo goes down, meets this guy named Gollum. Gollum says, I want to eat you. Bilbo says, I'd really rather you didn't. So they have a riddle game, right? And the terms are Gollum's going to eat him if he loses. That's the same. That's consistent. But Gollum says, if you win, I'll give you a present. By which he means the magic invisibility ring that he owns. It's not a ring of power yet. That hasn't happened until the Lord of the Rings. He's got this magic ring. He says, I'll give you a present. Bilbo has already found it up in the tunnel, just like he does in the modern edition. And when Gollum loses the riddle game, even on the rather sketchy "what do I got in my pocket" question, nevertheless, at that point Gollum actually plans to give him the ring. He's like, okay, you win, I'll give you the present. So he goes back to his island to look for the ring, and he can't find it, of course. Now what happens is not Gollum freaking out in the distance and then like coming to Bilbo with vengeance in his eyes. What has it got in its pockets? That's not what happens. Instead, Gollum comes tearing back from his island, overcome with remorse. I'm so sorry, I can't find a present. I was supposed to give you a present and I never cheat, and can you please forgive me for not having a present? And Bilbo's like, okay, it's fine, really, no, you're embarrassing me. Just show me the way out and we'll be square. And he's like, okay, but I really am sorry. And he's like, don't mention it. So he shows him the way out. They wave a cheerful farewell to each other, and Bilbo goes on his way. That's what happened in 1937. Then, of course, as Tolkien is developing the story of The Lord of the Rings, and the magic invisibility ring is no more just a magic invisibility ring, but becomes the ring of power with the corruptive evil influence, then he realizes, okay, I can make the rest of The Hobbit work, but that chapter, that's not going to work, right? There's a 0% chance that Gollum is ever going to be like, oh, it's fair, here's my ring of power. No, not going to happen. So he rewrote the chapter. And so the current version that everybody's familiar with, the Baggins, we hates it forever, like that, that's new. And that was put into the book. It was printed in 1951. He rewrote it about 46 or 47, about 10 years after The Hobbit was published. Now, finally, back to actually answering the question. What Tolkien did, which is so brilliant, and which makes that more than just kind of like a fun footnote for people who are interested in manuscript history, as you say, is that Tolkien takes that revision and incorporates it into the story of The Lord of the Rings. So he doesn't just try to hide the fact, right? I'm going to publish a second edition and hope that nobody notices the fact that chapter 5 is now quite different from chapter 5 before. No, instead what he does is he publishes, and it's there in this different version, and in the sequel, in The Lord of the Rings, he explains there were versions of this story. See, when Bilbo came back and wrote down the story, he lied. And he told this cheerful version of Gollum, oh, he wanted to give me the ring. I totally own it, fair and square. But it was a lie. That was the sign of the corruption of the ring. And so some versions of this got into circulation instead of the corrected form. So, readers, in 1954, if you happen to have an old copy of The Hobbit that doesn't have this other story that I'm telling you now, it's not a mistake. See, it's an interesting aspect of the story itself. And this is like part of this is just Tolkien's intrinsic like scholarly nerdiness, and because he did this in small ways as well as big ways. Like he never just went back and revised a thing and then tried to silently pass it over. Like anytime he did a revision, he would invent this like fictional manuscript history that would explain why there were two deviant versions of this text and what like scribal errors or things probably came in. And when it was transcribed from the Shire to the Gondorian scribe, they made some corrections of things that were confirmed and it's like really he was just revising the manuscript. But anyway, that's just the way that Tolkien thought. But again, it has a really wonderful effect because it really naturalizes that within the story itself and makes it far from detracting from the story. It actually gives the story a much richer depth than it would have had before. So, yeah.
Yeah, as you mentioned, The Hobbit was published 75 years ago this
Yes.
year.
Yes.
Also, September 22nd is International Hobbit Day.
That's right.
As it corresponds with Bilbo and Frodo's birthday. I'm wondering if you ever celebrate that or how you think would be the best way to celebrate.
I do. In fact, yeah, we just celebrated Hobbit Day yesterday. I celebrated Hobbit Day by taking part in like a 14-hour live internet broadcast celebration of Hobbit Day. We did discussions and we had readings of The Hobbit by
by scholars and fans and celebrities around the world reading their favorite passages, and it was really cool. It was a lot of fun, and I did broadcasts for like 4.5 solid hours yesterday afternoon for Hobbit Day. It was Hobbit Day and the 75th anniversary Hobbit Day. So yeah, and of course it is traditional and highly encouraged to have a nice second breakfast on Hobbit Day. You should make sure you have at least 6 meals on Hobbit Day. So yeah, that's yeah.
From your description in the program, I saw that you also teach courses on the Bible.
Yes.
So I wondered, with your understanding of Tolkien, how you see his Catholicism influencing his work.
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say that his Catholicism, his Christianity has a profound impact on his stories, on his whole worldview, and you can see that reflected. But I say that, and then I want to sort of be careful, because Tolkien was not really interested in sort of being out there and explaining Christianity. And I mean, many people know that Tolkien was very close friends with C.S. Lewis. The two of them worked together at Oxford. They, were part of a reading group together. They read each other's stuff. C.S. Lewis, by the way, Tolkien was very significantly responsible in helping Lewis become a Christian, and Lewis was very strongly responsible for helping Tolkien actually get anything published, because Tolkien was such a nitpicker. He would go through, he'd get like 4/5 of the way through a book, and then he'd put it down for the semester, and he'd teach, and then he'd come back in the next break and pick up the book again and start it over. That was his standard procedure, and it just drove, so C.S. Lewis was just like, finish it! So you get to the point in Lewis's published writings where he starts alluding to works that Tolkien has not yet finished but has been working on for a long time, and starts calling them like this forthcoming work by my friend Professor Tolkien. Nudge, nudge, nudge. Anyway, so the two of them were, but in this way, they're very different. C.S. Lewis, of course, was very actively involved in apologetics, in the defense of Christianity, in explaining the principles of Christianity to people. And one of the things of what he was interested in his stories, especially, of course, in the Chronicles of Narnia, they're not allegorical exactly, but that's a technical, when I say that, I'm making a technical distinction. He is very much trying to illustrate principles of Christianity. Tolkien had none of that impulse. In fact, it's one of the things that Tolkien and Lewis really disagreed about. Tolkien's opinion was, again, it's not that his faith was any less profound in his own life than Lewis's, but he felt that sort of explaining and teaching the Christian faith should be left to the professionals. So it was a conversation that he and Lewis had a lot as Lewis began to publish more doctrinal works, and he's like, look, you're not a priest. What are you doing? You're a layman. What are you doing? To which, of course, Lewis's response was, as soon as the priests start doing what I'm doing, then I'll stop. But anyway, so that was sort of a debate that they had. What this means for Tolkien's books, a lot of people basically they want to find Aslan in Tolkien, and he's not there. Tolkien has not, Lewis has very much told the stories. Again, they're not exactly allegories, but he has very much started with this central conception, right? What if the Son of God is incarnated in this alternate world, in the form of a lion? Now go. Stories ensue, and he plays that out and thinks about that. Tolkien not working that way. So on the one hand, I say his Christianity had a profound influence on him, but Gandalf does not equal Jesus. That's one of the main things that I sort of keep. Yes, like he dies and is resurrected, but basically there are lots of ways in which we can see Christian ideas and Christian principles informing what Tolkien is doing. And I think when you read it, you can see that stuff very clearly illustrated in a lot of the stories. But again, he's not kind of demonstrating it like that. So that is my answer to your question. Yeah, Liz.
Hi. You've probably already discussed this on a podcast, but I haven't been keeping up. So I was wondering if you had seen the newest trailer for The Hobbit and how you thought the tone was going to compare to the book.
Yes, that is a very interesting question. Yes, I
will admit that I was on my browser frantically refreshing, trying to get the trailer to show up when it was released. And so yes, I have in fact seen it. Peter Jackson has talked about wanting to maintain the tone. He wanted to be lighter and more comical. And that's one of the things that people have been saying, like, The Hobbit is a funny book. I mean, it's this cute, lighthearted, funny book. Well, yes. But see, there's a challenge, I think, a serious challenge in that the majority of the humor and the tone of The Hobbit is established by the narrator. Right? It's the stuff that the narrator says that are really funny and that really cue us to the sort of lighthearted thing. If you remove the voice of the narrator and you just play out the action, it's not going to look as funny. So when one objection I've heard about the trailer, people are like, oh, but it's so slapstick, right? That's why, do we really, or like the first trailer, right? Like, seriously, Bomber sits on a stool and it collapses under him? That's where we're going with this, Peter? Come on, seriously? That is, of course, not the comedy of The Hobbit, but again, I don't think you can do exactly the kind of comedy that The Hobbit does on film in the same way. So, in general, I will say, like, blanket statement, I've been really impressed by the stuff that Jackson has released. The Hobbit film stuff, has so far impressed me much more than the Lord of the Rings film did, with the fact that they really actually do seem to be reading really carefully. I keep noticing things. This did not happen to me a lot in the Lord of the Rings films, but I keep noticing things where I'm like, yeah, they noticed that little bit, right? There's like one little stray reference to one fact about a particular dwarf or something like that, and they've noticed that, and they've picked up on that, and they've expanded on it, they've added stuff, but there's stuff there. So I see some pretty good evidence of careful reading. So I'm happy. I am optimistic. I'm looking forward to it. We'll see, but yeah.
Are you planning on writing books on how to read The Lord of the Rings or just The Hobbit?
I am. I would love to. I need very little provocation to do that. So unless somebody forcibly intervenes to prevent me writing Exploring the Fellowship of the Ring, I almost certainly shall. The reason I did The Hobbit first, the reason I started with The Hobbit instead of going straight to The Lord of the Rings, is that I feel that too often The Hobbit kind of lives in the shadow of The Lord of the Rings. People often read The Hobbit first, but then they go on to The Lord of the Rings, and the Hobbit is sort of forgotten. It's not really given enough credit on its own for being not just a setup for The Lord of the Rings, but for being really the really complicated, interesting story that it is. So I knew that if I started with The Lord of the Rings and then went back to The Hobbit, it would be hard even for me to be kind of separating those things, and I wanted to talk about The Hobbit on its own terms. So most of the way through my book, I try to be really careful to talk about The Hobbit as it existed prior to The Lord of the Rings. So when we're talking about Gandalf, for instance, in The Hobbit, I'm trying not to, I'm actively walling out what we see Gandalf do, what we learn about Gandalf later on, because that's not the Gandalf of The Hobbit. Gandalf's character develops a lot in the 17 years that Tolkien is working on The Lord of the Rings. He's in a very different place, and I'm trying to deal with the story in those terms. So that's why I started with The Hobbit. I really wanted to sort of focus on that. Then we can move on to the Lord of the Rings stuff, and I definitely want to do that. Yeah?
Does it bother you that Peter Jackson is making 3 and possibly 4 movies of The Hobbit?
Yeah, I haven't heard 4, 3 so far. No, it doesn't. And actually, the reason it doesn't is for kind of just what I was describing. Like I said, The Hobbit existed by itself for 17 years. It was all anybody knew of Middle-earth. It was all that there was. And then, of course, during those 17 years, Tolkien is writing The Lord of the Rings, and he's not just writing another story or continuing another story. The world, the history, everything around The Hobbit has now grown and expanded. It's not changed completely, but there were so many things which are mentioned very, very briefly, but were stories that are unfilled out because Tolkien didn't really know. He didn't really have them in mind. Like, for instance, Gandalf leaves the dwarves in Bilbo and goes south for reasons he doesn't explain at the time, because he has other business, right? And then Bilbo and the dwarves go alone through Mirkwood. And he says later, in one sentence, in the last chapter, that where he went was to join with the White Council of Wizards who got together and kicked the necromancer out of Mirkwood. So now Mirkwood is going to be happier again. Hooray. What's up with that? What just happened there? Whom did he meet? What did they do? We don't know. Well, that's an example of one of the things that, of course, is filled out very much later on as he's writing The Lord of the Rings. And now the necromancer actually was Sauron taking shape again, and then we have his move into Mordor, and what Galadriel and Elrond already involved in this. He basically takes the Hobbit story by necessity. He takes the Hobbit story and naturalizes it into the world of The Lord of the Rings. That is the story, the post-Lord of the Rings naturalized Hobbit within the context of the history of the Third Age of Middle-earth as it's described in The Lord of the Rings. That's the story that Peter Jackson's telling. So he's not telling the 200-page 1937 novel. He is like Tolkien was, looking back at it from the point of view, from the world of The Lord of the Rings, and telling that bigger story. Which I think that does make a lot of sense, and when you do it from that perspective, I think that there's plenty of material. I mean, he's going to actually go into that story of the White Council and their conflict with the necromancer, for instance, which is a story which Tolkien talked about but never wrote. So yeah, I think there actually is. I know it sounds a little sketchy at first, right? Like 3 films on the entire Lord of the Rings and then 3 films on The Hobbit. But actually, I do think it makes sense. Great question, though. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed your talk. It's been fascinating, and it has been quite a number of years since I've read The Hobbit. So my memory is a little vague on this, but I remember in The Lord of the Rings, there's this return of the characters to the Shire and how they've been transformed. And
yes.
And you mentioned how Bilbo was transformed, and I never appreciated that in my reading and making that comparison. Now, would you say that the way that Bilbo returns, because he had to face a similar sort of change to Bag End, maybe not as drastic, but
right.
But he had. Do you think that the transformation that he experienced enabled him to face what he faced at Bag End differently than he would have had just gone off on holiday and come back?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it definitely, it doesn't, it's not just that it makes him appreciate home more, it certainly does, but it does definitely change his attitude towards it. And I think that we can see that kind of taking its, or coming to its logical conclusion in the beginning of the Fellowship of the Ring, right? Yes, he's more content than he was before, but of course what we also see at the beginning of the Fellowship of the Ring is that he really wants to go back now, right? He spends less and less time in Bag End and would really like to go off and see the elves again and see mountains again before he dies. This is the way he talks to Frodo at the beginning. So that's one interesting way that we can definitely see him changing. Thinking about with Frodo coming back at the end of the Lord of the Rings, one of the things that I think that Tolkien emphasizes a great deal more at the end of the Lord of the Rings than he does in The Hobbit is not just what is gained, which we can see in Sam, which we can see in Merry and Pippin especially, but in Frodo, what he emphasizes is what is lost. There's a deep sense of loss at the end of the Lord of the Rings. Frodo can't be healed. He can't really go back again. And in some ways you can see it corresponding to that. I think that's what suggests to me my reading of that second stanza of Bilbo's song. Eyes that fire and sword have seen and horror in the halls of stone look at last on meadows green. And he doesn't say what happens, right? Fact, eyes that have seen this now look back again. What happens then? With Bilbo, we see one version of what happens then, right? And that is recovery, new appreciation, new love. With Frodo, we see something else happening, right? And that is, he comes back and he says, I wanted to save the Shire and it has been saved, but not for me, right? Sometimes people have to give them up, lose them, so that others can have them. And that's one other thing that can happen, and it's sort of the natural extension of that. So I think that we can see him sort of looking at both sides of that. I think, do I have time for one more? No? Okay, I have to let you go. Thank you very much again for coming this afternoon.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.